The alarm on my scanner screamed before I even saw the wreck. I was 3 days deep into the ashfall belt, a graveyard of broken ships and dead stars, when my sensors locked onto a heat signature that should not have existed. Everything out here was supposed to be cold. Dead things do not give off heat. But something in that twisted hull was still alive, and that meant either treasure or trouble, and out here those two things usually wore the same face. My name is Ethan Blake, and I fly a ship called the Wanderlight, which is a very fancy name for something held together with patched plating and stubbornness. I make my living picking through the bones of battles that are not mine, selling parts, selling secrets, sometimes selling silence. I do not ask questions about who died and why. That is the rule that keeps me breathing. I broke that rule the moment I opened the wreck. The ship had belonged to the Valari Dominion, one of the great powers among the stars, a species of tall, silver-eyed people who look down on humans the way you might look down at insects crawling through your garden. Their fleets do not lose battles quietly. When a Valari warship falls, the whole galaxy hears about it. This one had fallen months ago, in a battle that had been broadcast across a dozen star systems. I remembered the headlines. Princess Elira Vantheon, heir to the Valari throne, killed in action, her flagship destroyed defending a border colony. Her death had changed everything. Grief turned into fury, and fury turned into war. The Valari Dominion had spent months burning through enemy territory in her name, calling every battle a tribute to their fallen princess. I had seen the propaganda broadcasts even out here in the belt, her face on every screen, painted as a martyr. So when my scanner told me something warm was breathing inside a stasis pod buried in the wreck of a ship that matched her fleet's registry, my hands went still on the controls. I told myself it was probably a soldier, maybe a pilot who got lucky. I told myself a lot of things as I suited up and crossed the short freezing gap between my ship and the wreck, my boots clanging against metal that had not felt footsteps in a long time. The inside of the wreck was worse than I expected. Corridors torn open to space, frozen debris floating in slow circles, the kind of silence that presses against your ears like water. I followed the heat signature through 3 collapsed sections, climbing over broken supports, until I found a chamber that had somehow stayed sealed. The stasis pod sat in the center, half buried under fallen debris, its casing cracked, but its systems barely clinging to life. Through the frosted glass, I saw her. Silver hair, pale skin with a faint blue undertone that marked her as Valari nobility. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Even half frozen and buried under the ruins of a warship, there was something unmistakably regal about her, like she belonged in a portrait, not a coffin. I did not need a facial scan to know who she was. I had seen that face on 100 broadcasts, mourned by an empire, painted onto banners and monuments. Princess Elira Vantheon, supposedly dead for months. And she was breathing. For a long moment, I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. If word got out that I had found her alive, half the galaxy would want to know how. The other half would want to make sure she stayed dead. I did not know which side was more dangerous, and I did not plan on finding out the hard way. I could have called it in. There were bounties for information like this, official channels, alien authorities who would have paid well for the safe recovery of their princess. But something about the whole situation itched at the back of my mind. Her ship had been destroyed in a battle that ended a war of vengeance. If she was alive, then everything the Valari Dominion had done in her name for the last several months had been built on a lie. That kind of lie does not survive contact with the truth, and people who tell lies that big do not like being caught. I made my decision standing in that frozen chamber, staring at a stranger's face through cracked glass. I was not going to call anyone. I was going to get her out myself, quietly, and figure out the rest later. Getting the pod free took almost an hour. I had to cut through 2 support beams and reroute what little power remained in the wreck just to keep her stasis field stable while I worked. My hands were shaking by the time I finally pulled the pod loose, and not just from the cold. I kept glancing at her face through the frost, half expecting her eyes to snap open and half hoping they would not, because I had no idea what I would say if they did. Dragging the pod back to my ship was the hardest physical work I had done in years. Zero gravity helps with weight, but momentum is a cruel thing, and more than once I nearly lost control of the pod and sent it drifting off into the dark forever. By the time I sealed it inside my cargo hold and pressurized the compartment, I was soaked in sweat inside my suit and breathing like I had run a marathon. I stood there afterward, staring at the pod through the small window in my cargo bay door, and asked myself what exactly I thought I was doing. The honest answer was that I did not know. I was not a hero. I did not have some noble code that demanded I save princesses from frozen wrecks. If anything, my instincts told me to leave her, to fly away and forget what I had seen, because getting involved in Valari politics was the kind of decision that got people killed. But there was something about the image of her floating there, forgotten, mourned by a lie, that I could not shake loose. Maybe it was the unfairness of it. Maybe it was simple curiosity. Maybe some part of me just wanted to know why a princess who was supposed to be dead had been left drifting in a wreck instead of being recovered by her own people. Whatever the reason, my course was set the moment I decided not to open a channel and report what I had found. I settled into the pilot's seat and set a course away from the wreck, keeping my sensors quiet, my engines low, my ship as invisible as I could make it. If anyone had been watching that wreck, waiting to see if someone like me would come poking around, I did not want to give them a reason to follow. The stasis pod systems were failing fast. I could see the warning lights blinking through the cargo bay window, red pulses counting down toward a failure that would kill her long before I could get her anywhere safe. I did not have proper medical equipment. I did not have alien medical training. What I had was a small ship, a basic first aid kit designed for humans, and a stubborn refusal to let this go so easily. I opened a channel to the pod's failing systems and did the only thing I could think of. I transferred what power I could spare from my own life support into the stasis field, buying time I did not know how to use. Then I sat down at my console and started searching every scrap of data I had on Valari physiology, trying to figure out how to keep an alien princess alive with human tools in a ship never meant to carry anything more delicate than scrap metal. The pod's systems gave out completely 6 hours later. I heard the alarm before I saw it, a high, panicked shriek that sent me running to the cargo bay so fast I nearly cracked my head on a support beam. The stasis field had collapsed. She was no longer frozen, no longer suspended in that strange, half-alive stillness. She was simply unconscious, breathing on her own for the first time in who knew how long, and completely at the mercy of whatever I could figure out in the next few minutes. I got the pod open and pulled her free, laying her down on the thin medical cot I kept in the corner of my cargo bay, the one I mostly used for storing spare parts. Up close, without the frost and the glass between us, she looked smaller than she had in the broadcasts, fragile in a way that did not match the legend built around her name. Her skin was cold, too cold. I grabbed every blanket I had on the ship and wrapped her in them, then checked her pulse the way I had been trained to check a human's, hoping Valari physiology was close enough that it would tell me something useful. It was slow but steady. That was something. I did not sleep that night. I sat beside her cot with a datapad in my hands, cross-referencing everything I could find about Valari biology, trying to figure out what she needed and what might kill her if I got it wrong. Somewhere around the 4th hour, her eyes moved beneath her closed lids, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see if the woman the whole galaxy believed was dead was finally going to wake up. She did not wake that night, but her breathing grew steadier, her pulse grew stronger, and for the first time since I had pulled her out of that wreck, I let myself believe she might actually survive. I looked at her face in the dim light of my cargo hold and thought about the broadcasts I had seen, the mourning, the war fought in her honor. None of it matched the quiet, fragile woman lying on my cot. Somewhere between that wreck and this moment, the truth had gotten lost, and I had no idea yet just how deep that lie went, or how much danger I had just pulled into my life along with her. All I knew was that I was not turning back now. She woke up screaming. It happened on the 2nd day, while I was checking the engine readouts in the cockpit. The sound that came from the cargo bay was not the confused cry of someone waking from a nightmare. It was the sharp, controlled scream of someone who expected to be in danger and was ready to fight for her life. I dropped what I was doing and ran, half expecting to find her already halfway through tearing my ship apart. Instead, I found her pressed into the corner of the cargo bay, wrapped in the blankets I had used to keep her warm, her silver eyes wide and locked on me like I was the greatest threat she had ever faced. Her hands were raised in some kind of defensive stance, fingers curled like claws, though she looked barely strong enough to stand, let alone fight. I raised both my hands slowly, the way you might approach a frightened animal, and kept my voice low. I told her my name. I told her she was safe. I told her I was not going to hurt her. She did not believe a single word. Her voice, when she finally found it, was hoarse from disuse, but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room like a blade. She demanded to know where she was, who I was, and why a human had dared to put its hands on Valari royalty. Even weak, even frightened, even wrapped in blankets on the floor of a scavenger's cargo hold, she spoke like someone who had never once in her life expected to be disobeyed. I answered her questions as plainly as I could. I told her I had found her ship in the Ashfall belt, that her stasis pod was failing, that I had pulled her out because leaving her to die had not felt like an option. I did not tell her about the broadcasts, about the war fought in her name, about the fact that her entire empire believed she had been dead for months. I figured that was a conversation that needed more than a few minutes and a healthy dose of trust neither of us had yet. She studied me for a long moment, her silver eyes narrowing, searching my face for a lie. Whatever she was looking for, she did not seem to find it, because slowly, carefully, the defensive posture eased, though the suspicion in her expression did not go anywhere. Her name, she finally told me, was Elira. She did not offer her title. I did not ask for it, though I already knew exactly who she was. The next few days were a strange kind of dance. She was proud in a way I had never seen in a human, carrying herself like royalty even while confined to a small cargo hold with nothing but blankets and borrowed clothes. She refused my help more times than I could count, insisting on standing when she should have been resting, insisting on feeding herself when her hands still shook too badly to hold a cup steady. More than once I had to catch her before she collapsed, and each time she looked at me with the same mixture of gratitude and irritation, as if being helped by a human was an insult she could not quite decide how to feel about. I learned quickly that Elira did not trust easily, and she trusted humans least of all. She had grown up hearing stories about my species, most of them unflattering, painting humans as short-lived, short-sighted, and dangerously unpredictable. I did not blame her for the caution. From what she had been taught, trusting a human with her life should have been the last thing she ever did. But circumstances have a way of forcing trust where none existed before. On the fourth day, her strength returned enough that she could sit up on her own, and she finally asked the question I had been dreading. She wanted to know how long she had been in that pod. I told her the truth, because lying about something that big felt like the fastest way to lose whatever fragile trust we had built. Months, I told her. Her ship had been destroyed in a battle that the entire galaxy believed had killed her. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had experienced in that ship before. I watched her face shift through disbelief, confusion, and something darker I could not quite name. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge of royal command and had become something quieter, more uncertain. She did not remember the battle ending. She remembered fighting. She remembered her ship taking damage far worse than it should have, systems failing that should never have failed, and then darkness. She remembered being sealed inside a stasis pod by hands she could not see clearly, hands that had not felt like rescue. I asked her what she meant by that. She told me that stasis pods on Valari warships were reserved for critical personnel during evacuation, and that protocol demanded any pod containing a member of the royal line be immediately transmitted with an emergency beacon, broadcasting its location to every allied ship in range. If her pod had been sealed correctly, rescue would have arrived within hours. Instead, she had drifted in that wreck for months, forgotten, her beacon either disabled or never activated at all. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the pieces started falling into place. A pod that should have signaled for rescue immediately, sitting silent in a wreck for months while the galaxy mourned her death and fought a war in her name. That was not an accident. Accidents did not require someone to disable an emergency beacon on a royal evacuation pod. Someone had wanted her to disappear. Elira reached the same conclusion at almost the same moment I did, and I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. Her hands curled into fists against the blankets, and for the first time since she had woken up, the proud, defensive mask she wore slipped completely, replaced by something raw and afraid. She asked me, very quietly, who would have done this to her. I did not have an answer. I was not part of her world, did not know her court, her advisors, the people who surrounded her before the battle that supposedly ended her life. But I told her the truth, which was that whoever had silenced that beacon had access to her ship, her evacuation protocols, and enough influence to make sure no one came looking for her once she was gone. That meant it was someone close, someone who had been trusted. Over the following days, as her strength continued to return, Elira began sharing fragments of her life before the battle, not because she fully trusted me yet, but because she needed to think out loud, and I was the only one there to listen. She told me about her court, about the tensions simmering beneath the surface of Valari politics, about factions who believed war was the only path to strength, and others who wanted peace at almost any cost. She told me about her mother, the reigning monarch, aging and increasingly reliant on her council for guidance. She told me about a man named Kael Dravos, the regent who had served her family for decades, trusted by her mother almost as much as family. She spoke his name carefully, like she was testing how it felt in her mouth now that suspicion had colored everything about her past. I did not push her toward any conclusions. I let her talk, let her work through the tangled mess of memory and fear on her own terms, while I quietly started digging through whatever scraps of data I could pull from my ship's systems and the wreck's black box, which I had salvaged without really thinking about why at the time. What I found did not make me feel any better about the situation we were in. The black box data was fragmented, damaged by the same attack that had destroyed the ship, but I managed to recover enough to confirm what Elira had told me. The emergency beacon on her stasis pod had been manually disabled less than 2 minutes before the ship lost power completely, not damaged by battle, disabled deliberately by someone with access to the pod's control systems, someone who had been standing close enough to make that override in the chaos of a losing fight. I showed her the data late on the 6th day, watching her face carefully as she processed what it meant. She stared at the readout for a long time, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. She told me that only a handful of people had clearance to override evacuation protocols on a royal pod. Her mother, her personal guard, and Kael Dravos. I asked her what she wanted to do with that information. For the first time since I had pulled her out of that wreck, I saw something shift in her expression that was not fear, and was not royal pride either. It was resolve, cold and sharp, the look of someone who had just realized the war fought in her name had been built on a foundation of betrayal, and was not going to let that stand quietly. She told me she needed to go home. Not quietly, not through official channels that could be intercepted or silenced, but in a way that could not be denied, hidden, or explained away by whoever had left her to die in that wreck. I reminded her that whoever had done this had access to her ship, her protocols, and enough influence to keep a princess's disappearance quiet for months. If they learned she was alive before we were ready, they would not hesitate to make sure she disappeared again, permanently this time. She looked at me, silver eyes steady, despite everything she had just learned, and told me that was exactly why she needed my help. Not the help of Valari soldiers, not the help of official channels that could be compromised, but the unpredictable, unofficial kind of help that came from a human scavenger who had already proven he did not follow the rules everyone else expected him to follow. I sat with that for a long moment, weighing what she was asking against everything I knew about the danger involved. Getting mixed up in Valari politics was already reckless. Getting mixed up in a conspiracy against the Valari throne was something else entirely, the kind of decision that could get both of us killed before we ever got close to answers. But I thought about that stasis pod, drifting silent and forgotten in the dark, for months while a galaxy mourned a lie. I thought about the calculated, deliberate cruelty of disabling a rescue beacon and letting someone believe they were saving a life, while actually condemning it to a slow, quiet end. I told her I would help her get home, not because it was safe, and not because I fully understood what I was walking into, but because whoever had done this to her deserved to be exposed, and because some decisions, once made, do not leave much room for turning back. Alira did not smile, exactly, but something in her expression softened, just slightly, the first real crack in the careful royal composure she had maintained since the moment she woke up screaming in my cargo hold. We had a plan forming, even if it was still rough around the edges. We had a target, even if we did not yet fully understand his reach. And we had each other, an unlikely pair thrown together by wreckage and lies, about to walk straight into the kind of danger that had already once tried to make sure the princess never woke up at all. So, before we could return Alira to her people, we needed proof. A princess appearing alive after months of mourning would raise questions on its own, but questions without answers could be twisted, denied, or buried by someone with enough power and enough motive to keep her disappearance permanent. If we were going to walk into the heart of the Valari Dominion and accuse a regent of betrayal, we needed more than memory and a disabled beacon. We needed a trail that could not be explained away. I set a course for a station on the edge of neutral territory, a place called Corvant Reach, known among people like me as a hub for information that official channels preferred to stay buried. It was not glamorous. It was cramped corridors and flickering lights, and the kind of clientele who asked no questions because they had plenty of their own worth hiding. But it was also home to people who specialized in finding exactly the kind of truth we needed. Alira did not like the plan. She made that clear more than once during the journey, arguing that stepping into a den of smugglers and information brokers was reckless when she was still recovering, still vulnerable, still completely dependent on a stranger's ship for safety. I did not disagree with her concerns. I just did not have a better option to offer. We disguised her as best we could, covering her silver hair beneath a worn hood, dulling the faint blue undertone of her skin with a layer of synthetic pigment I kept on hand for exactly these kinds of situations. She hated every part of it. Royalty, apparently, did not enjoy pretending to be nobody. The information broker I sought out on Corvant Reach was a woman named Grace Sutton, a former Valari fleet technician who had left military service years ago under circumstances she never fully explained to anyone, myself included. She had a reputation for being expensive, thorough, and completely unbothered by whose secrets she was digging through, as long as the payment was good. I found her in the back room of a cluttered workshop, surrounded by more salvage tech than I had ever seen in one place, and told her exactly enough to get her attention without revealing who was waiting on my ship. Grace listened to my carefully edited version of events with narrowed eyes, the kind of look that told me she already suspected I was leaving out the most important part of the story. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and asked me a single question. She wanted to know if the person I was protecting had anything to do with the sudden increase in bounty chatter she had noticed over the past week. Quiet, unofficial requests circulating through certain channels, offering an enormous sum for information regarding unusual activity near the Ashfall belt. My blood went cold. Someone was already looking. Someone already suspected that the wreck Alira had drifted in for months had been disturbed. I told Grace the truth then, because half measures were not going to get us the help we needed, and because I trusted her reputation for discretion more than I trusted my own ability to keep this contained on my own. I told her who was hiding in the disguise back on my ship. I watched her expression shift from professional curiosity to genuine shock, and then, slowly, to something more calculating. She agreed to help, though not without a price that made my stomach twist when she named it. But money was not the problem. Time was. If bounty chatter was already circulating about the Ashfall belt, that meant someone had noticed the wreck had been tampered with, and it would not take long for that someone to start connecting the pieces. Grace worked fast once she had the full picture. She pulled records from Valari military archives, some official, some clearly acquired through channels she did not explain and I did not ask about. Over the following 2 days, holed up in her cluttered workshop, while Elira stayed hidden aboard my ship, we began piecing together a picture far larger and darker than either of us had expected. The battle that had supposedly killed Elira had not gone the way official records claimed. According to the sanitized version broadcast across the galaxy, her flagship had been overwhelmed by enemy forces during the defense of a border colony, fighting valiantly before being destroyed with all hands lost. But the technical logs Grace recovered told a very different story. Elira's flagship had entered that battle with a full battle group, 5 additional warships providing support and cover. According to deployment records, those support ships had received emergency redeployment orders less than 10 minutes before the enemy's decisive strike, pulling them away from the flagship at the exact moment they were needed most. The orders had come through proper channels, properly authorized, properly logged. They had been issued by Kale Dravos. I felt the weight of that discovery settle over the room like a physical thing. A regent, trusted for decades, had ordered the ships protecting the princess to abandon her position minutes before an attack that should have been survivable with proper support. It was not an accident, not a tragic miscalculation in the chaos of war. It was a deliberate, calculated act, timed with precision that left no room for innocent explanation. Grace dug deeper, cross-referencing financial records, communication logs, anything that might explain why a man who had served the royal family for decades would orchestrate the death of the heir he had sworn to protect. What she found painted a picture of a growing conspiracy far larger than a single betrayal. In the months leading up to the battle, Kale Dravos had been in regular, quiet contact with a faction of military commanders who believed the Valari Dominion's cautious approach to expansion was a weakness, that true strength required aggressive conquest rather than careful diplomacy. Elira, according to intercepted communications, had publicly opposed that faction's ambitions on multiple occasions, arguing for restraint, for alliances built on trust rather than domination. Her death, and the war of vengeance it sparked, had conveniently silenced her voice of restraint while simultaneously providing the perfect justification for the aggressive military campaign her opposition had wanted all along. Grief made for powerful propaganda. A martyred princess, killed defending her people, was far more useful to that faction dead than she had ever been alive and arguing against their ambitions. I sat back from the console we had been working at, trying to process the sheer scale of what we had uncovered. This was not a simple act of personal betrayal. This was the deliberate manufacturing of a war, built on the sacrifice of a princess who had never actually died, orchestrated by a man trusted enough to have access to the very systems that should have protected her. Grace pulled one more piece of data before we finished, something that made the entire picture click into place with sickening clarity. Financial records showed a significant transfer of resources from military contracts directly benefiting several companies with known ties to Kale Dravos, contracts that had multiplied several times over since the war began. He was not just manufacturing a war for ideology, he was profiting from it, personally and substantially, every single day it continued. When I returned to my ship and shared everything we had found with Elira, I watched her absorb the information with a stillness that worried me more than any outburst would have. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carved from something that looked almost like stone. It was only when I finished that I saw the faint tremor in her hands, the only outward sign of how deeply this had shaken her. She told me that Kale Dravos had held her as a child. He had taught her to fly a shuttle before she was old enough to attend formal academy training. He had stood beside her mother at every major ceremony of Elira's life, a fixture so constant she had never once considered him capable of something like this. I did not know what to say to that. There was no comfort I could offer for a betrayal that deep, from someone that close, built on years of manufactured trust. All I could do was sit with her in the silence, while she worked through the wreckage of everything she thought she knew about the people closest to her. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost the tremor. What remained was cold, focused, and utterly certain. She told me the evidence we had gathered would not be enough on its own. Kale Dravos was regent, trusted by her mother, embedded deep enough in the machinery of Valari government that circumstantial evidence, however damning, could be dismissed, buried, or explained away by someone with his level of influence and years of carefully cultivated loyalty. If we brought this evidence forward through official channels, it would disappear before it ever reached anyone capable of acting on it. The only thing that could not be buried, she said, was her. If she returned alive, publicly, undeniably, in front of witnesses who could not be silenced or bought, the entire foundation of the narrative Kale Dravos had built would collapse instantly. A martyred princess who returned to accuse her regent directly could not be dismissed as easily as a data file that conveniently vanished from the archives. But that plan came with a risk neither of us could ignore. The moment Kale Dravos learned Elira was alive, and learned that we had uncovered enough evidence to expose him, he would not hesitate to make sure she disappeared again, permanently this time, before she ever got close enough to speak against him publicly. We needed a way to get her home that did not give him time to react. We needed to move fast, quietly, and smart enough to stay ahead of a man who had already proven he was willing to sacrifice a princess and manufacture a war to protect his own ambitions. Grace, when I returned to her workshop to discuss next steps, offered one more piece of information that changed the shape of our entire plan. She told me that a formal ceremony was scheduled in 11 days at the Valari Royal Court, a memorial gathering marking the anniversary of the battle that had supposedly claimed Elira's life. Dignitaries from allied systems, military leadership, and the entire Royal Council would be present, gathered publicly in one location to honor her memory. It was, Grace pointed out, either the worst possible moment to reveal that Elira was alive, or the single best opportunity we would ever get. I looked at Elira across the cramped workshop, watching the calculation forming behind her silver eyes, and I understood exactly what she was thinking before she said a single word. She wanted to walk into that memorial alive, in front of every person Kale Dravos had manipulated into believing his lies, and expose him in the one place he could not possibly control the narrative. It was reckless. It was dangerous beyond anything I had signed up for when I first pulled her out of that wreck. But it was also, I had to admit, the only plan with any real chance of working before he found a way to silence her permanently. 11 days. That was all the time we had to cross hostile territory, avoid a regent with the resources of an entire empire at his disposal, and deliver a supposedly dead princess into the heart of a memorial being held in her honor, all without getting caught before we arrived. I looked at Elira, and for the first time since pulling her from that frozen wreck, I saw not just fear or uncertainty in her expression, but something sharper, determination, the look of someone who had decided, completely and without hesitation, that she would rather face every danger between here and home than let a lie built on her supposed death stand unchallenged for one more day. I told her I was in, all the way, whatever it took to get her there. She looked at me for a long moment, silver eyes steady, and told me that she was starting to understand why her people had underestimated humans for so long. We had a plan, we had a deadline, and somewhere out there, a man who believed his secret had died with her in that wreck was about to learn just how wrong he had been. 11 days sounds like a lot of time until you try to cross 3 hostile star systems in a ship never designed for anything more dangerous than hauling scrap metal. We left Corvant Reach before dawn, if a station without a real sun could be said to have a dawn at all, slipping out through a maintenance corridor Grace Sutton had arranged for us, one that avoided the main docking registry entirely. She gave us one last piece of advice before we left, telling us that the bounty chatter she had noticed earlier had grown louder overnight, no longer vague rumors about unusual activity near the Ashfall belt, but specific requests for information about a human ship matching the Wanderlight's registry. Someone already knew my ship's name. That meant someone already suspected exactly what I had done. I pushed the engines harder than I probably should have as we cleared the station, setting a course that deliberately avoided the most direct route toward Valari space. Direct routes were predictable, and predictable was the last thing we could afford to be. Elira spent those first hours studying star charts with an intensity that told me she was thinking several steps ahead of where I was. She knew Valari patrol patterns, checkpoint locations, and the political boundaries between systems in a way no outdated map could teach me. For the first time since I had pulled her out of that wreck, I saw her lean into her role, not as a frightened survivor, but as someone who had been trained her entire life to navigate exactly this kind of danger. She suggested a route that cut through a stretch of contested space between two rival systems, territory too politically messy for either Valari patrols or bounty hunters to operate freely, without risking an incident neither side wanted. It was not a safe route, it was simply less watched, which in our situation was worth more than safety. We made it through the first system without incident, though I did not relax for a single moment of it. Every blip on my sensors sent my heart into my throat. Every unfamiliar ship silhouette on the horizon made my hands tighten on the controls until my knuckles ached. The second system was where things went wrong. We were halfway through a routine transit lane when my sensors picked up 3 ships breaking formation from a nearby patrol route, altering course to intercept us with a precision that told me this was not a random patrol. Elira confirmed my fear a moment later, recognizing the ship configuration from the sensor readout as a bounty-hunting collective known for operating just outside official Valari sanction, the kind of independent contractors who took jobs too dirty for regular military channels. They had found us. I ran through every option available to a scavenger ship facing 3 hunters with better weapons, better shields, and better speed, and came up with nothing that involved winning a straight fight. Straight fights were not something the Wanderlight was built for, but straight fights were not the only kind of fight there was. I banked hard toward a dense debris field marking the edge of an old mining collapse, the kind of hazard most pilots avoided because navigating through scattered wreckage at speed was a good way to get yourself killed. It was also, I gambled, exactly the kind of maneuver a sleek hunting ship with more speed than maneuverability would hesitate to follow into. Elira grabbed the edge of her seat as I threw the Wanderlight into the debris field, weaving between chunks of broken asteroid and old mining equipment with a recklessness that made every alarm on my console scream in protest. Behind us, one of the hunting ships clipped a piece of debris trying to follow too closely, spinning off course with visible damage to its hull. The other 2 slowed, more cautious, giving me the gap I needed. I killed my engines completely once we were deep enough into the field, letting momentum carry us silently between 2 large chunks of broken rock, powering down everything but the most essential systems to reduce our heat signature to almost nothing. It was a trick I had learned scavenging in fields exactly like this one, the kind of maneuver that worked because most pilots assumed a ship without power was a dead ship, not a hiding one. The 2 remaining hunters swept through the field searching for us, close enough at one point that I could see the running lights of their ship through a gap in the debris, close enough that Elira stopped breathing entirely beside me. But drifting silent and powered down, we looked like just another piece of wreckage among thousands, and after nearly 20 agonizing minutes, the hunters gave up the search and pulled back to rejoin their damaged companion. I did not power the engines back on until they were long gone from my sensors, and even then, I kept us moving slow and quiet for another hour before finally opening up the throttle again. Elira let out a breath she had clearly been holding for most of that hour, and when she looked at me, there was something new in her expression, something that had not been there before. It was not quite trust, not yet, but it was respect, the kind that comes from watching someone perform well under pressure you did not expect them to survive. She told me that in Valari military doctrine, that kind of maneuver would never have been taught, because relying on stillness and unpredictability instead of superior firepower was considered beneath a proper warrior's training. I told her that scavengers did not have the luxury of superior firepower, so we learned to survive on whatever cleverness we could scrape together instead. She was quiet for a while after that, and when she finally spoke again, it was to ask me more questions about my life before all this, about growing up human, about a species her people had always dismissed as primitive and short-lived. I answered as honestly as I could, and somewhere in that conversation, stretched across hours of careful travel through hostile space, the wall between us started coming down in a way that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with genuine curiosity. The third system brought a different kind of danger entirely. We had nearly reached the border of Valari core territory when Grace Sutton's warning proved accurate in the worst possible way. A checkpoint that should have been a simple customs stop turned out to be staffed with soldiers carrying image files that matched, unmistakably, the disguised face sitting beside me in the cockpit. Kale Dravos had reached further than we expected. He had somehow anticipated that Elira might attempt to return through official channels, and had quietly placed watchers at exactly the kind of checkpoint a returning princess would eventually need to cross. I did not slow down as we approached the checkpoint. Instead, I opened a channel and did something that went against every instinct a smuggler develops over years of avoiding attention. I identified myself honestly, using my actual registry, and requested emergency medical clearance, claiming a passenger suffering from a rare Valari condition requiring immediate specialist attention at the capital, a condition serious enough that any delay could prove fatal. It was a gamble built entirely on the assumption that bureaucracy moves slower than suspicion, that a soldier faced with a medical emergency claim and an unclear chain of authority would hesitate to challenge it without confirmation from someone higher up the chain, confirmation that would take time we were counting on them not having. The gamble worked, but only barely. The checkpoint officer clearly recognized something in Elira's disguised features that troubled him, hesitating long enough that I saw his hand drift toward his communicator, ready to call for verification that would have ended everything right there. I pushed the medical emergency angle harder, describing symptoms I had half-invented from fragments of Valari medical data Grace had shared with us, watching the officer's uncertainty grow with every passing second. In the end, it was Elira herself who tipped the balance, playing the role of a suffering patient with a level of commitment that genuinely startled me, her breathing turning shallow and labored, her hands trembling in a way I could not tell was performance, or the very real exhaustion of the past several days finally catching up with her. The officer waved us through, choosing the path of least resistance rather than risk being responsible for a medical emergency turning fatal on his watch. We cleared the checkpoint with our hearts pounding and did not speak again until the border was far behind us. Elira broke first, letting out a laugh that surprised us both, sharp and slightly hysterical with the release of tension that had been building for hours. She told me that pretending to be dying had apparently been easier than most of her royal etiquette training, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something close to genuine warmth in her expression when she looked at me. We were close now, close enough that the weight of what came next settled over both of us with growing seriousness. Somewhere ahead lay the Valari capital, the memorial ceremony marking the anniversary of her supposed death, and a regent who believed his secret had died along with her in that wreck. Elira grew quieter as we approached, her earlier laughter fading into focused determination. She told me that the hardest part was not going to be reaching the capital, it was going to be standing in front of everyone who had mourned her, everyone who had been manipulated into believing a war built on her death was justified, and finding the words to make them believe the truth over the version they had already accepted. I told her that if anyone could do it, it was the person who had just talked her way past an armed checkpoint by pretending to nearly die on command. She managed a small, tired smile at that, the first real smile I had seen from her since pulling her out of that stasis pod, and for a moment, the danger still waiting ahead of us felt just slightly more survivable. We had made it through hostile space. We had evaded hunters and checkpoints and everything Kale Dravos had thrown in our path so far. But the hardest part of this journey was not behind us. It was waiting just ahead, in a memorial hall full of people prepared to honor a lie, completely unaware that the truth was about to walk in and demand to be heard. The Valari capital rose out of the horizon like something built by people who had never once doubted their own permanence. Towers of pale stone and silver metal catching the light of a sun far brighter than anything I was used to seeing from the edge of known space. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest tighten, because somewhere in the heart of that beauty was a man who had built a war on top of a lie, and we were about to walk straight into his territory, to tear that lie apart in front of everyone who had trusted him. Getting into the capital itself proved easier than I expected, largely because Elira knew every hidden entrance, every service corridor, every overlooked access point that generations of royal children had used to slip away from their tutors and guards growing up. She guided us through a maze of underground passageways beneath the palace grounds, with a confidence that told me this was not the first time she had used this exact route to move unseen through her own home. We reached a small storage chamber connected to the memorial hall roughly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and it was there that the full weight of what we were about to do finally settled over both of us in the quiet. Elira changed out of the worn traveling clothes she had been wearing since we left Corvant Reach into a formal gown Grace Sutton had somehow managed to acquire through channels I still did not fully understand, deep blue fabric that matched the traditional colors of Valari mourning, an almost cruel irony given what she was about to do. When she finally stood before me in that gown, her silver hair no longer hidden beneath a disguising hood, she looked every bit the princess the galaxy had mourned for months. She asked me, quietly, if I thought this would work. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know, but that I had watched her talk her way past an armed checkpoint while pretending to be dying, and if anyone could walk into a room full of people and make them believe an impossible truth, it was her. She reached out and took my hand then, just for a moment, her grip tighter than I expected from someone who still looked so fragile in places, and told me that whatever happened next, she would not have made it this far without a stranger who had chosen to save a life instead of walking away from a problem that was not his to solve. I did not have a good response to that, so I just squeezed her hand back and told her it was time. The memorial hall, when we finally reached the edge of it through a service entrance near the rear of the massive chamber, was already filled with hundreds of people. Dignitaries from allied systems sat in formal rows, their robes and uniforms representing a dozen different worlds. Military leadership stood at attention near the front, medals catching the light from enormous windows that stretched toward a ceiling so high it made the whole space feel like standing inside a cathedral built for giants. At the very front of the hall, standing beside an elderly woman I recognized instantly as Elira's mother, the reigning monarch, was a tall Valari man with silver hair streaked through with darker gray, his posture radiating the kind of practiced solemnity that comes from decades spent performing grief and duty in equal measure. Kael Dravos looked exactly like what he had spent years pretending to be, a loyal servant of the crown, mourning a princess he claimed to have loved like family. I felt Elira's hand tighten around mine as she watched him speak, his voice carrying across the hall through some kind of amplification system, delivering a eulogy about sacrifice and duty and the terrible cost of war, words that I now knew were nothing but a carefully constructed performance built on top of a lie he himself had orchestrated. Elira waited until he reached the closing lines of his speech, the moment where his voice grew thick with practiced emotion as he spoke about honoring her memory through continued strength and resolve, before she stepped out from the shadows of the service entrance and walked directly down the center aisle of the memorial hall. The reaction rippled through the crowd like a physical wave. Gasps turned into shocked silence, and shocked silence turned into rising murmurs of disbelief as hundreds of people turned to stare at a princess they had been mourning for months, walking calmly and deliberately toward the front of the hall in the exact deep blue mourning gown that had been chosen to honor her memory. Kael Dravos's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, so brief that I doubted anyone but Elira and I, watching him with the specific knowledge of what he had done, would have caught it, but I saw it. A flicker of pure shock, followed almost instantly by something colder and far more calculating, the look of a man rapidly recalculating every plan he had built around the assumption that this moment would never happen. Elira's mother rose from her seat with a speed that belied her age, one hand pressed against her chest, tears already forming in eyes that had clearly spent months believing her daughter was gone forever. She said Elira's name in a voice that cracked with disbelief and desperate hope, and for a moment, the entire political weight of what was about to happen faded into something much simpler and far more human, a mother reunited with a daughter she thought she had lost. Elira reached her mother's side and embraced her briefly, and even from where I stood at the back of the hall, I could see genuine tears on the princess's face, the first real crack in her composure since I had pulled her from that wreck. But she did not linger in that reunion for long. She turned instead to face the crowd, to face the cameras I now noticed were broadcasting this ceremony across allied systems, and to face Kale Dravos, who stood frozen just a few steps away, his carefully constructed performance of grief evaporating into something far more dangerous. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried across the silent hall with a clarity and strength that made it hard to believe she had spent months trapped in a failing stasis pod. She told the crowd that she had not died defending that border colony. She told them that her ship had been abandoned by its support fleet minutes before the decisive attack, support that should have been there, ordered away by someone with the authority to issue that command and the intention to make sure she never survived what followed. She told them that her stasis pod's emergency beacon, which should have summoned immediate rescue, had been deliberately disabled, leaving her drifting forgotten in the wreckage for months, while the galaxy mourned a death that had been engineered rather than earned in honest battle. Murmurs turned into open shock as she spoke, hundreds of faces shifting from disbelief at her survival to growing horror at what she was describing. Elira did not stop there. She turned directly toward Kale Dravos and named him, publicly, in front of the entire assembled court and every camera broadcasting the ceremony, as the man responsible for both decisions. Kale Dravos, to his credit, did not immediately crumble. He straightened, his expression shifting into something that almost looked like wounded outrage, and began to protest, his voice carrying the same practiced authority that had convinced an empire to trust him for decades. He called her accusations grief-driven confusion, the understandable but mistaken conclusions of a traumatized survivor who had suffered greatly and deserved compassion rather than being asked to level such dangerous claims without proof. This was the moment we had planned for. I stepped forward from the back of the hall, my presence drawing a fresh wave of murmurs from a crowd already overwhelmed by the events unfolding in front of them, and activated the datapad I had carried through every mile of our journey, the one containing everything Grace Sutton had helped us recover. I did not need to say much. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own once it was displayed across the hall's large ceremonial screens, originally meant to show images honoring Elira's memory, now instead showing deployment records with Kale Dravos's authorization codes, financial transfers linking him directly to military contracts that had multiplied since the war began, and intercepted communications revealing his coordination with the aggressive expansion faction Elira had spent years publicly opposing. The hall fell into a silence far heavier than the earlier shock, the kind of silence that comes when hundreds of people watch a carefully constructed lie collapse in real time, replaced by a truth too damning to explain away. Kale Dravos's mask finally broke completely. Whatever calm authority he had maintained through Elira's initial accusations shattered as the evidence continued displaying across the screens, and in the space of a few desperate seconds, I watched a man who had spent decades building an empire of trust and manipulation realize that every piece of it was collapsing in front of the very people he had spent so long deceiving. He tried to run. It did not get him far. Royal guards who had spent months serving under his authority, now faced with undeniable proof of his betrayal against the very princess they had been mourning, moved with the swift, decisive efficiency of soldiers who understood exactly what needed to happen next. He was restrained before he made it more than a dozen steps down the center aisle, his protests of innocence growing increasingly hollow with every word. What followed was chaos of a different kind. the controlled chaos of an empire scrambling to process the collapse of a narrative it had built its entire recent history around. Elira's mother, still processing both the joy of her daughter's return and the horror of the betrayal that had nearly cost her that daughter forever, called for immediate investigation into every decision Kael Dravos had made during his years as regent, and for the military campaign built on Elira's supposed death to be halted immediately pending full review. Over the following days, the fallout spread through Valari politics like a fire through dry grass. The aggressive expansion faction that had benefited from the war lost credibility almost overnight, their carefully cultivated narrative of righteous vengeance exposed as manufactured propaganda built on a foundation of betrayal and manipulation. Diplomatic channels reopened with the systems that had suffered the brunt of the vengeance campaign, and though the damage of months of unnecessary conflict could not be entirely undone, the war itself finally began winding toward an end built on truth rather than a lie that should never have started it in the first place. I stayed close through most of it, watching from the edges as Elira reclaimed a role she had never actually lost, though the woman who emerged from those chaotic days looked different from the frightened, defensive figure who had woken up screaming in my cargo hold weeks earlier. She carried herself with the same regal confidence as before, but something had shifted underneath it, a hard-earned understanding of exactly how fragile trust could be, and exactly how much courage it took to fight for truth when the comfortable lie would have been so much easier to accept. On the evening after the investigation officially confirmed everything the evidence had already shown, Elira found me on a quiet balcony overlooking the palace grounds, away from the crowds and ceremonies and endless political meetings that had consumed every hour since her return. She stood beside me in silence for a while, watching the same bright sun I had seen on our approach, slowly setting behind the pale towers of her capital. She told me that she did not know how to properly thank someone for saving her life twice, once by pulling her from a wreck she should never have survived, and once by helping her find the courage and the proof to reclaim the truth that had almost died along with her. I told her she did not owe me anything, that I had made my choice standing in that frozen chamber weeks ago, and that whatever came of it, I did not regret a single moment of the danger we had walked through together. She was quiet for a long moment after that, studying my face with the same careful attention she had shown that very first day, searching for something in my expression the way she once searched for lies. Whatever she found this time, it seemed to settle something in her, because the smile that finally crossed her face was different from anything I had seen from her before, warm and unguarded, in a way that had nothing to do with royal composure at all. She asked me what I planned to do now that her people knew the truth, now that the danger that had followed us across 3 hostile systems had finally been resolved. I told her I honestly did not know. My life before all this had been simple in its own way, scavenging wrecks, avoiding entanglements, staying far away from exactly the kind of political storm we had just walked through together. But something about that simple life felt smaller now, less interesting, compared to everything I had experienced pulling a supposedly dead princess back from the edge of oblivion and helping her reclaim a truth an empire had almost buried forever. Elira told me that her mother, grateful beyond measure for her daughter's safe return, had already begun discussing formal recognition for the human who had risked everything to make it happen, official ties between our people that had never existed before, built on the foundation of what we had accomplished together. I told her that sounded like more politics than I had ever wanted to be part of in my entire life. She laughed then, a genuine sound, nothing like the careful, controlled amusement I had first heard from her weeks ago, and told me that perhaps I did not need to accept every formal honor her mother wanted to offer, but that she, personally, was not quite ready to say goodbye to the human who had refused to leave her behind in that wreck, when every reasonable instinct should have told him to fly away and forget what he had seen. I looked at her standing there in the fading light, a princess the entire galaxy had once mourned as dead, now standing very much alive beside the stranger who had refused to let that lie stand, and found myself thinking that whatever came next Whatever strange new chapter of my life was beginning on that quiet balcony overlooking a capital I had never expected to see, I was not in any hurry for it to end. The galaxy had believed the princess died in battle. They had built a war around her memory, mourned her loss, and let a lie reshape the fate of entire star systems. But lies, no matter how carefully constructed, tend to crumble eventually under the weight of a truth determined enough to survive. And sometimes, that truth needs nothing more than a stranger willing to make one simple choice, standing in a frozen wreck at the edge of nowhere, deciding not to walk away.